Hey everyone, welcome back. OD Baby here. I wanted to talk today about a new feature of the Method Raid Tools add-on called Reminders that I am personally using to help boost my defensive play. I think everybody else is going to find it very useful, especially people who play proactive defensive classes such as Mage, like I do myself. If you enjoy, please like and subscribe the video, and I hope you find it useful. Here we have the MRT add-on Method Raid Tools, and what most people are going to know this for is either the notes, which you can see here. Generally, your raid leader would push you some notes that have some tie-ins to weak auras or timers. And if you have the Kaze weak aura, it would pop up a reminder on your screen when to do something, or this assigns certain people to certain ads, stuff like that. But recently, in April of 2024, MRT included this reminder field or section. And in this is basically effectively weak auras. It's a just different UI, a little bit simpler. I know weak auras has made some improvements to its UI recently, and specifically to its ability to track, or it's for users to trigger off of combat log events. But this is very simple, very easy to use, very nice grouping. As you can see, like I have things for all the bosses of the next raid already. But I wanted to show how I've been using this to sort of plan out my defensives as a mage. That has really led to some great results. So in the results category, I've only actually used this once to test it out in a fight, and that was on Fyrakk. So as we can see here, and you don't need to know what all of this is yet, but I made reminders for various mage abilities like Alter and boss abilities like the APOC Roar in Phase 3, and did that for just various abilities throughout the fight that I felt I might need to defensive, like a barrier, ice cold, mirror images if it's off CD, Alter for specific mechanics. Nothing too drastic. I didn't go like crazy, like, oh, the first time that he cast this ability, I want to use this, the second time that, like yada yada. No, it's basically very simple. For the most part, it's just like use a barrier on Blaze if wildfire isn't about to happen. Otherwise, use a barrier on wildfire. Use a barrier on the flamefall when the boss comes back down. Use alter time on some specific abilities, and use ice cold at specific times. None of that is very involved, and the results from that, and maybe I'll be able to put them up on the screen if I figure out how to do that, since this is one of my first YouTube videos, was that I got a rank 5 healing on Fyrakk, and not just rank 5 healing for mages or for frost mages, but I actually was able to mitigate 71% of all of the damage that I took throughout the fight. And I took like a lot of blazes. I actually got targeted by, I think, like every blaze in the fight. So I was very high up on like the number of blaze hits and stuff like that of unavoidable damage that I would take. Yet I still took second least out of every player in the raid in total damage. The person who was below me only got targeted by Blaze twice. And I was only like 1 million total damage, taken more than he was. So yeah, it's pretty impressive how just really simply setting this up for some base abilities, boss abilities, and your own defensives can really make a huge difference in not having to think about, should I press something here, should I save it for later, and really kick your survivability up a notch. Like, I'm pretty sure during this Fyrakk pull, I was never below 50% health, and like obviously it's re-clear, so that doesn't really say too much. You could be over, under healing, whatever. But when I compare it to like our other mage in the group, like he was below 50% multiple times in the fight, like 11 times in the fight or something like that. And I think I was below 50% once, maybe. And this is also without using a health pot or a health stone. This is just mage abilities, so it's pretty impressive. So let's get into the actual how to use these and how to create them. So you can see there that you can basically assign them to specific bosses, similar to weak aura's load conditions. But if we go into, let's just pick a relatively simple one, which is going to be like pressing mirror images on CD. So this is one of the most basic things, which is basically exactly what a weak aura would do for telling you that mirror images is off cooldown, right? How you can set this up is to track the actual spell cooldown of an ability. You would want to invert it, because this would tell you, if you didn't invert it, would just tell you that it's off cooldown. So it would actually trigger when it's not available, or when it's on cooldown, sorry, when it's not available. So you want to invert that. And then I have this just extra trigger here that you don't need to worry about. But basically, this is a super basic thing that just says, tell me what is going to, when mirror images or any spell is available. And that's just when it's going to trigger. And so this, at its very simplest form, seems like pretty basic. Like, why do you need this, right? You have mirror images tracked here. Yeah, sure, absolutely. That's totally fine. That makes a lot of sense. What becomes more interesting is when you start to add a little bit more of nuance to when you want things to show you if they're available or not, or certain situations. So the really powerful thing that you can do here that you can't do in, say, like an MRT note, if you're just pulling that straight from Lorgs, is that you can add basically as many conditionals as you can think of. Just like in weak auras triggers, you can have a trigger for any part of an ability in different phases, different counters, whether you have certain buffs or debuffs on you at the time, whether you have certain spells available. So looking at this one is a little bit more specific. This is for the first boss of the next raid. This is specifically on his digestive acid, which I believe is the dot that you're going to get to be able to clear the webs in the mechanic. I believe that that's this one. But basically what this is saying is, I want this to trigger when the boss ability is going to happen within 9 seconds. And it is the third time that he has cast that ability in the fight. And then it's going to re-trigger. %2 is basically saying every other time. So every second one. So this is going to trigger on whenever he casts this ability, digestive acid, after the third time he's cast it, and then every 2 after that. So 3, 5, 7, 9, 11 throughout the fight. So that starts to get a lot more specific there. And then I have the check for, is my ability available? Obviously, you're going to want that, so it's not telling you to press an ability that you don't have. And then this other check, which is very useful for mage things like barrier, is don't tell me to press it if I already have the actual barrier on me. So if I were to use a barrier like ice barrier, if I have this up now, this trigger will stop this from firing if I have the barrier on me, so that I'm not just wasting a barrier, wasting a global when I could be doing damage. So this is where things start to get really, really powerful, is you can basically include as many conditions as you want. You can get as specific as you want, as pre-planned as you want. You can go all the way down to like, okay, for the first time he casts this ability, if I have this other debuff on me, I want to use this defensive, or I want to use this defensive if I don't have the debuff on me. And the next time he casts the ability, I want to do something else. It starts to get extremely powerful. You can kind of go overboard to where it's like completely unnecessary and you're probably doing stuff that doesn't really matter. But for people who like pre-planning, this is a very, very powerful tool. And I'll walk through like how to actually create one of these in a second. But I just wanted to talk about like the various things that you can do with it and that I'm doing with it. It's very useful, especially for proactive classes like mage. Reactive classes, maybe this isn't as useful, but you can still do things like setting a trigger for if your health is below 50% and you have this debuff on you and another ability is coming up soon. Press a defensive, use a health pot, a health stone, self-heal, something. You can set all of that up in here. The other really cool thing that you can do, and I have it in a test here, is for classes with a lot of potential abilities that they can use for a various event, you can actually set up a multi-trigger effectively for a bunch of different spells that you would want to use. So this is just a test. So the trigger is actually just going to be on me casting Frostbolt on this target dummy. But basically it's going to trigger. You could set this to, if this was an actual fight, this would be like on a DBM timer, or if the boss targets you for some ability, something like that. And then you can see down here is basically every spell that I want to consider. So I have Ice Cold, Greater Invis, Mirror Images, Alter Time. These are all sort of strong defensives for my class. And I'm checking to see if any of them are available. you can see that I have the and on the first one. And if you hover over it, it's going to tell you exactly what this means. This is basically saying that this whole thing is only going to activate if trigger 1 is active and one of those next 4 triggers. So trigger 1 has to be active and 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 have to be active. So basically that's saying I cast Frostbolt on my target and I have one of these spells available to use. It's pretty much what that's saying. And we'll get into this in a second of how this actually text lines up, but I just want you guys to be able to see what this is actually going to do. So I have it based off of alter time, mirror images, invis, and ice cold, and I have it to trigger set when I cast Frostbolt on this target, based off of what abilities are available. So how I currently have it set up, you'll see here,
alter,
that I have it tell me to press alter because I have alter available. So anytime I cast Frostbolt on this guy, it's going to tell me to alter.
Alter.
Now, let me use alter so it's not available. So now when I cast Frostbolt on this guy, it tells me to mirror image. And that's going to be true all while alter time is not available. Do the same thing, press mirror images, so that's no longer available. What's next?
Invis.
Invis. And same thing.
Invis.
Use invis. My last thing.
Ice cold.
Ice cold. Use ice cold. And now there's nothing. So now it doesn't trigger anything because I don't have any of my spells available. This is where, especially for mages, I don't know about other classes with how many defensives they have that can all handle relatively the same situation, but for mages, this is where it gets insanely useful. So for things like a big hit, or you're just not sure what ability you want to use at any given time, you don't know what may be available, you can literally just throw them all into this thing, track all of their availabilities, and then in the text, how you actually set this up is basically the order that you want to do this, or the order that you want your abilities to be used in if they're available is the order that you put them in the text. So you'll see that alter is first. So it's basically saying, check if alter is first, and if it is, tell me to use that because that's the first one I want to use. Then go to mirror images, then go to invis, then go to ice cold. This just gets to be so crazy useful and is so good for these, especially like defensives that can all do the same thing. Where you don't have to think at all anymore. Like theoretically, I could remove all of my tracking of these 4 defensives from my weak auras entirely. Like I don't even have to think about them because if I pre-plan this stuff properly, if I set this up for the abilities that I want it to be used for, then I will always know which ability is available and which one to use because it's just going to straight up tell me. It's going to tell me straight to my face. That is so incredibly useful for freeing up your brain power to do other things, to handle mechanics, to make sure your DPS is high. For me, I'm going to be raid leading this tier, so making sure I'm able to pay attention to and make raid calls as efficiently as possible. Stuff like this is going to be so useful. So I wanted to walk through real quick how to actually set one of these up. So I'll create a new one. And there's some quirks that I've noticed with this app. And as I said, since it does have, it's basically just a wrapper on top of weak auras. Like everything you do in here could be done in weak auras. I kind of like the UI of this a little bit better. However, I've also noticed some bugs and issues with this that may have me thinking like maybe I just do this in weak auras, or at least do some of these in weak auras. I definitely do like the UI. I like the grouping. I like the ease of being able to create things and duplicate them, change them slightly, all that sort of stuff works great. But for some things, you know, it does have limitations, it does have bugs. But let's get into it. So for a very simple one that we wouldn't be able to test here, I'll show you how to test some of them and other ones that you won't be able to test. But most things that would trigger off of like a boss mechanic happening or something, you won't be able to test just in a city. You would be able to test it by going to an old dungeon and pulling the first boss of the dungeon, as long as you set up the load conditions right, which we can get into. But for now, I just wanted to go over some things. You have your very generic, basically just on boss pull on timer. So this would basically be like setting up an individual line of a MRT note. So if you see, this is a really old one from the start of the raid tier, but I have like at 3 seconds, tell me to Radiant Spark, right? So if I wanted to duplicate that in here, I could just do show in 3 seconds and say Radiant Spark here. give this a random name. Sound, I like to use text to speech. Text to speech for me is great because I don't have to think about anything. I don't have to think about what icon it is, what I need to do, what that sound means is telling me to do. None of that. Just straight up tells me the word. This type is basically, there's just 3 different types that you can actually use in these settings, and you'll see them here. But they have big text, normal text, small text, big bars, small bars, test bars, and you can move them around with the icons. But that's just what that is showing you. I usually just use normal text for most of these, but if you want more importance to big or small, it doesn't matter. Duration is how long it would stay on the screen for. A lot of the ones I use for 5 seconds because a lot of mine are countdown to ability timers. But this one, it wouldn't really matter, right? It's just saying show it in 3 seconds on pull. You could leave this however long you want, 2 seconds, sure. Countdown will add a countdown next to whatever text you have it say. So it would say Radiant Spark 2, 1, 0, and then it would hide away. The countdown is going to last for however long your duration is, so it'll always be equal to when the message is going to disappear off the screen. And that's really it. Like, that's all you need for basically duplicating an MRT note line. You just have your trigger for time, and you have it tell you what you want it to do. You can add in an icon here. Like if I wanted this to be barrier instead, you can do something like this. And you can see in the example test now it has a little icon, and that is what's going to show up on the screen. How you get this to load for specific bosses or encounters is you go over to the players/load tab. This is very similar to WeakAura's load settings. So you go in here and you can select a specific boss. You don't even have to know the encounter ID. It has, I believe, all or most bosses back to, what is this, ICC or something like that? So very far back, Legion, Emerald Nightmare. Or you can go to custom encounter ID and type in the ID yourself if it's a dungeon boss or if it's an even older boss or something like that. You can just go find the ID on Wowhead and type it in here. You can also, instead of loading by boss ID, you can have it how I have to test right now in Valdrakken, is to load by zone. You can always just set it to select your current zone wherever you are, so you'll be able to test anything. You can also set it to load on different raid difficulties. So you can set it to only load certain ones on Heroic if you have different strategies for Heroic and Mythic. You don't have to worry about these too much. This is basically for if you were a raid leader who was going to send these to other players. So the neat thing about these is that instead of like WeakAura's where to share them, you basically copy and paste this link and you send it and you give it to people and they have to click it and import it in. You can actually manually push these to other players just like you would an MRT note, which gets to be very useful if you wanted to actually use this as your like WeakAura pack, which we can talk about in a bit. But yeah, so this is how you would set this up. And I can set this up for, I don't know, Ulgrax, the first boss of the next raid, to say 3 seconds into the fight, tell me to barrier. And it would just do it, and that's it. And that is a very easy way to basically just duplicate MRT notes into this add-on. Into this feature of the add-on. This feature is a lot more powerful when you don't tie it to direct times, but instead tie it to abilities or combat events. Because that's the thing that MRT notes can't do. Like if you were going to do this, why not just put it in an MRT note? It's a lot easier to copy paste and move around and stuff like that. So the real power of these is when you get into doing things like a combat log event where a cast success has happened or a cast start has happened. If the boss starts to cast an ability, the boss completed an ability, an aura was applied or removed, like a debuff or a buff on anybody, spell damage being done, anything like that. This is where it gets really, really powerful, and this is where the UI really simplifies things for people who may not be that familiar with these. So say I just wanted to create a trigger on some cast success event, and for right now, we're just going to use Frostbolt because I can test that easily here. But this could be any ID. It could be an ID of a spell that you cast, that a healer casts, that a tank does, that the boss does, anything. As long as it is in the combat log, which is pretty much everything that's cast in a combat in an actual fight, can be in these triggers. Then you would select basically who cast it as your source unit. I'm going to use player because I'm testing it for me. If you were trying to select specific people, You could use their actual name. So if I wanted to select myself as name, it would be OD Baby Mage. If I wanted to select our tank, I could use them if it's going to be a spell for them. You can select specifically your target, your focus, mouse over. Boss 1 is usually the main boss of any encounter. You can set it to any raid member or any party member, any boss, to basically catch wide-ranging things like, I don't know, tell me whenever somebody uses a health stone or something like that. So I'm going to set it to player for now. You can also do it by ID, which is actually what I'm going to use here because I want to specify this a little bit more. Right now, this will trigger anytime I cast Frostbolt on any target in this zone that I'm currently in. I want it to be a little bit more specific. I want it to say only trigger if my target is this training dummy. So 194648. So that's going to say this is only going to trigger now if in the combat log there is a Frostbolt success cast from me on this target. And that's pretty much what I want. Get rid of this because that's a leftover from the other thing. So now I have that. And I currently have it to just tell me to Ice Barrier with a countdown. I have it set to text-to-speech. Let's just turn it off text-to-speech for now. So we'll make no sound for now and it'll just show. And then we click save. And if we go into our reminders for the current zone, I accidentally set it to load on Olgrax. That's why. There you go. Select current zone, save, boom. There you go. That's why. So here it is. So I'll turn off this other one that I had for testing, but here it is. We found it. It's loaded into this section for the current zone. You can see that these are the ones that are loaded because they say now on them. So it should tell me whenever I cast Frostbolt to barrier, boom, just like that. And it's got my icon because I have the spell icon, and it's got the countdown for the duration, which is 2 seconds. And this will continue to trigger anytime I successfully cast Frostbolt. If I don't successfully cast, it won't trigger. So if I do that and then turn around, it doesn't trigger. So let's get into a little bit one of the more complicated ones, which is basically when some event happens and I have a spell available. So let's try now and add a little bit more flavor because this is just triggering on one event. Let's say, okay, I want to trigger on an event if I have a certain ability available. So let's go to spell cooldown and let's check for mirror image. 55342 and invert it to say we only want to trigger if mirror images is available. And now we save that. So currently mirror image is available. Let's cast Frostbolt. It's still triggering. That's good. We use mirror images and it should not trigger. And there you go. It doesn't trigger. So now whenever this event happens, it's only going to tell us to press something if mirror images is available, which is exactly what we want. And this is where you can start to get pretty cool with added things. So, one quick thing, you can duplicate something if it's very similar. So let's use Ice Barrier. 11426, we're going to set this to OR. So now I want it to trigger if either mirror images or Ice Barrier is available. So it should currently trigger because Ice Barrier is available. If I use Ice Barrier, both of those are on cooldown, so I can't use them, so it doesn't trigger. If I get my Ice Barrier ability back, it should start triggering again. There you go, triggers. Now, here's where things get interesting. So it doesn't really matter what order I add these spells in. It's going to track them all as long as you have the first one set to and all of the other spell cooldowns set to or, and you have them all right after the other. If you wanted to add more combat log events or something like that, so like Frostbolt is cast and I have this buff at the same time, you would put those next to each other at the top and just make sure all of your spell cooldowns are in a row together at the bottom. So this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So what if I wanted to change the text based off of what ability I have? Or yeah, let's just leave it at that. Change the text based off of what ability I have. I can make it say whatever I want. I want it to say Ice Barrier if Ice Barrier is available. If Ice Barrier is not available and Mirror Image is available, I want it to say Mirror Images. And if they're neither of them available, obviously it won't fire, so it shouldn't say anything. So you can do that, and you can see how you would do it by hovering over the question mark over here, which gives you this massive list of basically everything you could do. And I'm just going to print screen on this so you can kind of see it, but it would be the conditional section here is the section you would want for being able to handle changing any text in your message based off of some condition. So you can see the most basic form here is you're going to put curly brackets, COND for condition, with colon, condition 1, whatever your condition 1 is, equals whatever your condition 2 is. So this could be the status of that trigger for your spell is on or off. So it's available or unavailable. And then if those two are actually equal, you would get yes, which is whatever text you want to put here for if those are true. And then you semicolon, no, for whatever it should say when it's false. And that is the general build of how you're going to be able to basically change this text to say whatever you want it to say based off of whatever conditions are true in your triggers. That way you could have this fire, like I could turn off these spells trackers entirely. And so this would actually trigger every time this combat log event happens. And then I can just have it change the text to whatever I want it to be based off of if these triggers are actually on or off. So it doesn't stop the global thing from activating or not based off of these, but then I can still change the text based off of them. For now, I just want it to activate or not activate with the spells, so I'm going to leave them on. So let's try it. So we're going to do a conditional. And again, you can see in here a lot of the different options that you can choose. The first section is a lot about the actual player or target or something like that. You can see player name, player class, spec, all that sort of stuff. The second section that starts with like percent counter is things that are based off of the triggers that you have in your actual actions. So the one that I'm going to want is that third one that says percent status X, which is basically going to tell me whether the X numbered trigger is on or off. So if I go back here and I check my triggers, I have mirror images as trigger 2, ice barrier as trigger 3. And previously I said you want to order them in the order that you want them to show up as to whichever one you want it to say first. If that's available, that's the most important one. You want that listed first. So we're going to go with ice barrier first. So even though ice barrier is trigger 3, I can still set it to be the one that I want it based off of first. So trigger 3 is the one we want to check the status of. So it's percent status, and then X is the trigger number, so 3. And so that's my first condition, is basically what is the status of trigger 3. And I want this to be true when ice barrier is available to use. Now here's a little bit of the quirkiness of this add-on, is this percent status for spell cooldowns. You have to remember basically what this would be saying if this was inverted. So in its base form, the spell cooldown tracker is activated when the button is not available. So when I've already used ice barrier and it's on cooldown and it's waiting for it to come back up, that's when the base spell cooldown is active. So I have it set to be active the opposite way when it is not on cooldown, when it is available. However, the percent status of that trigger is still based off of the non-inverted version, the base version. So basically, it gets a little weird. But in order to track spell cooldowns effectively and change the text properly, basically what you want to know is in the actual trigger, you want this to be inverted. And to check if it is actually on and basically saying, okay, this ability is available, that means the percent status is actually set to off, because it's how the add-on works. The percent status is tied to the base way that the trigger is supposed to be, which is not inverted. So when the trigger is not inverted, it would be off when your button is available. It would be on when your button is not available. So we want to track off, basically saying percent status 3, what is it? Is it equal to off? If that is true, I want it to tell me whatever this text I'm about to write here, which is just barrier for now. And then we do a semicolon and we say, okay, if it's false, what does that mean? That means that trigger 3, or our tracker for ice barrier cooldown, is off. The spell is not available. So if the spell is not available, what do I want to have happen? Well, for me, I have two spells that I can do. I can do Ice Barrier, I can do Mirror Images. So I want to check the status of Mirror Images then. So if Ice Barrier is off, say, okay, can I press Mirror Images? So same thing. We're going to present status 2 for Mirror Images because it's my second trigger. And same thing, we're going to check if it's off. And now we're back in the same loop. The first text that we write here is if that trigger was true. So Mirror Images is available. So I would want it to tell me to press Mirror Images. And then what we can do now is basically we don't have anything else after this. If Mirror Images isn't available, we also know that Barrier isn't available because we checked Barrier first. So neither of those are available. We don't have any more choices. We don't have to put a false section here. So we don't have to do a semicolon and add other stuff. We can basically just end our conditionals because there's nothing else that we want it to do. But if we did want it to say something, we could try and add it in here. However, it's not going to work because we have our triggers set up to only actually fire if one of these spells is available. So for now, we're just going to leave it blank. And basically to end your conditionals, you do another curly bracket, you do a backslash, COND to basically say, I ended it. This is my start of my conditional, and this is my end of my conditional. And since we have two starts, we need two ends. So now we have our conditionals set up. Now what should happen is whenever we cast Frostbolt on this target, because that's our first trigger, it is going to check the status of trigger 3. And if trigger 3 is off, that means Ice Barrier is available. It's going to tell us to Barrier. If trigger 3 is not off, Ice Barrier is not available, it's going to check the status of trigger 2, which is Mirror Images. And if it's available, it'll tell us to press it. If it's not available, it'll tell us nothing because nothing will be firing. So let's save that and let's test it out. Let's cast a Frostbolt. And as expected, this is telling us to cast Barrier because we have both Barrier and Mirror Images available, but the first thing we check is Barrier. So if Barrier is available, it's telling us to press it. It's that simple. If we use Barrier, like we have now, and you can see there already the text changed a little bit, but now when we cast, we get Mirror Images. So just as expected, Barrier is now off cooldown, Mirror Images is available. It's telling us to cast Mirror Images. I'm not going to use Mirror Images yet because I want Barrier to come back up, just to show you that like right when Barrier comes back up, boom, the message changes. Barrier is available again, we can press it again, boom, we press it, Mirror Images is available, we press Mirror Images, now neither of our spells are available, now it doesn't fire, doesn't say anything. So it's working exactly as we expected it to. One quick note is you saw sometimes in there that the actual text on the screen changed because either Barrier wasn't available and then it became available while the text was still on the screen, or it was available and we used it and it switched immediately to Mirror Images. One way to avoid that text switching so that you don't have it say like, oh, if my duration is 5 seconds, it's up on the screen for a while, I press Barrier immediately, then it immediately switches to the next text, and I'm like, oh shit, do I need to press Mirror Images too? Quick thing you do is just click No Dynamic Updates. This will make it so even if the status of your triggers changes while it's still showing on your screen, it will not affect the current text that's on the screen. So if you're casting Frostbolt and it tells you to Barrier and you have Mirror Images available, and then you press Barrier, it's not going to change the text. It's just going to keep saying Barrier, 3, 2, 1, countdown, disappear. The next time you cast Frostbolt, it would tell you to Mirror Images. So just a little helpful tip for not having it change the status. But yeah, there we go. That was pretty much it. We just created a trigger that will tell us to press one defensive if it's available. That's our first one we want to check. And then our next defensive. And then you could just copy this down the list for how many defenses you want, whatever you want. Health pot, health stone, whatever your class is, proactive, reactive defenses, doesn't matter. And this is also the base way that you would test most of your things. If you're not confident that your spell cooldown tracking is working, or if you had something else, debuff or buff tracking, chat messages, your health percent, whatever, this is the way you can test them. You would put all of your triggers that you want to test in here, and then you would just do a simple combat log event for cast success for a spammable ability that your class has, whatever that is. Mage has Frostbolt in all of its specs, so I can just use that. And then you would just sit here and test it on here. If you had a health percent tracker, say I wanted to add one for like less than 50% health, I could add it in here. I could go fly up on my mount and drop down to get the low health outside, run back in here, cast my survivability, and I could test it. The thing that you can't test here is actual boss things, because this is not a boss encounter. So you can't test boss phase, boss pull, DBM timers. To do those, you would actually have to go to a boss somewhere. It doesn't need to be the one that you specifically want, although if it's not the one that you're specifically doing triggers for, then you're not going to have the exact messages. But you can test generic boss DBM timer or generic boss pull or potentially phase, depending on what boss you go and find. I like to use Eye of Ajara just outside of Legion Dalaran. First boss is very easy to get to. You run there on your mount inside the dungeon. You can pull it immediately. And then you can test things like on boss pull. So time after the fight has started. You can test things like on timer. Well, you can't really but you'd have to set it to that boss's specific IDs of abilities, but you could test to make sure it works. You could basically say whatever that boss's first ability casts on the DBM timer, I want this to show up 5 seconds before that ability is cast. I want it to show up only for the second time he casts that ability, and that's it. And you can do things like that to be able to test whatever you want. Obviously, if you want to test specific things for a specific boss, you have to actually go and do that boss to test it. A good way to do that would be like LFR. But that's just a quick thing to know. So overall, I plan to use this, and you can kind of see it here. I've actually already planned them all out, except for last boss. I plan to use this for basically all of my defensives for next year. It seems extremely useful for proactive classes like Mage, especially for someone like me who's going to be raid leading, to take my mind off of my actual survivability. Now the only thing I have to pay attention to is handling mechanics that I have to handle, my DPS, and then I can focus all the extra time on my raid and actually raid leading. So I think this is going to be super, super useful. In a different context of how to use this add-on, and actually the original reason that I started looking into this is that, as I mentioned before, you have the ability to actually push these notes, whatever you create, to any other player. And you can set load conditions here, so you can just push them to your whole raid, and I can say I only want this to load for mages in my raid. So even though everybody in the raid has it, it's only actually going to load and do anything for mages. You can set it to all players, to be everyone, all that sort of stuff. You have tanks, healers, damage dealers, ranged, melee, all that good stuff. The reason that I was looking into it was actually from a raid leading perspective, as a potential way to replace weak aura packs. So everybody knows of the difficulties with the weak aura packs in Amir Drasil, and making sure that everyone is on the same weak aura version, making sure that you, even raid leader, has the most updated weak aura version. The liquid packs have 3 different packs of weak auras that you have to get. If anybody's wrong, they're going to be off. You're basically playing the weak aura and making sure that the weak aura is right for a lot of these fights. Smolderon orbs, Fyrakk intermission, Fyrakk cages, like huge pain. Obviously that depends on how Blizzard designs its fights for how useful weak auras can be. But I was looking for a way to make us more independent from these weak aura packs, to allow us to do things ourselves, and we would be more in control. Obviously that means we have to do more work. One of those methods could be this feature of method raid tools. So you'll see you have like global and personal. That doesn't really mean too much, but basically things that are in global are easy to send all of them to everyone in your raid. And effectively then you can kind of treat this as a MRT note, which pretty much everybody already uses. The MRT notes currently tie into like the liquid weak aura packs, the Northern Sky weak aura pack, stuff like that, Kaze raid timers. But you would be able to create effectively your entire weak aura pack in MRT reminders and then just push those to your raid. Nobody else needs a specific version of weak auras. I don't even think you really need a specific version of MRT, as long as you have the one updated enough to have the reminder feature. You can push them all to your raid. Everybody's always going to have the correct ones. And as you can see here, like I was kind of testing out and playing with it, of actually making a weak aura pack in MRT reminders. So what is it going to tell my raid to do? It's going to tell my raid there's a knock in 5 seconds, or we have to clear webs in 5 seconds. There's a group soak in mid in 8 seconds, stuff like that. You can get as specific as you want to tell your raiders exactly what you want to tell them, and effectively do the same thing as weak auras. The big thing for me is that it gives us the ability to control and make sure everybody has the right stuff without just saying everybody go update weak auras, and then you have like a weak aura check add-on thing, and then somebody still doesn't have the right thing and you find out mid-pull. I have found issues or difficulties with doing that, and one of the ones is one of the main things that weak aura packs handle, which is priority grouping. Or priority selecting, I should say. Basically, if multiple people in your raid get a debuff or an ability or a mechanic or whatever, how do you choose who has to do what? Who has to go where? Who's going to skull marker? Who's going to X marker? Who's going to purple marker? Who's going left? Who's going right? Who gets dispelled first? All these sorts of things is basically combined into just priority lists. How do you prioritize X number of people or things to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? I haven't found a way to actually do that in this add-on yet, and that is the main limiting factor for me seeing it being used as a weak aura pack replacement. MRT or Method, who when they put out the article about this even says like, hey, this isn't a weak aura pack replacement or a full weak aura replacement, but it's pretty close. But the missing link of priority lists is a pretty big negative for trying to use this as a weak aura pack replacement as is. Now, I could just be not smart enough and be missing something. But as far as I can tell, there is no direct functionality that I can see that does prioritization. Prioritization in weak aura packs is almost always done, as far as I know, as custom code, and there is no way to put in custom code into MRT reminders. So that in and of itself is a pretty big limiter. But the whole point of MRT reminders is to be basically simplified weak auras to let people who aren't comfortable doing custom code get into these more customizable and more specific situations that would help them play without having to take that barrier of learning how to do the custom Lua code. For people like myself, who I am a software engineer, I know how to code in Lua, it makes it kind of limiting, but there is obvious benefits, specifically for doing more quote unquote simple but intermediate things instead of beginner things, like creating these reminders based off of combat log events. Combat log events is basically like the stop between a beginner weak aura user and an intermediate weak aura user. Most people who do weak auras would know how to create a spell cooldown tracker or a debuff warning. But most people, if you tell them, okay, create something based off of a combat log event, they would probably just short circuit. So this helps to bridge that gap a little bit and make it more accessible into that intermediate level for people to do a little bit more difficult things and a little bit more specific stuff that can elevate their play without getting into custom coding. I think that is absolutely a sweet spot. I think it's going to be incredibly useful for that. Obviously, you can see I plan to use it exclusively for all of my defensives. I might even add offensives into here or movement reminders and stuff like that. Super, super valuable tool for those reasons. Obviously, it has its limitations. It has its bugs. One of the bugs that may or may not be happening right now, I actually tested it a little bit earlier and it didn't work, and then it did work, is that for some abilities, the spell cooldown tracker just doesn't work. One of the main ones being alter time. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, where it'll tell me alter time's available, and then I'll use alter time and it'll still tell me it's available. So there's some bugs like that that make me think, okay, maybe it is better to just scrap all this and just go with weak auras, because it's very likely that weak auras is going to work all the time no matter what. But I'm willing to try it out anyway, just to see how it goes. I've told my raiders about it. A couple of them are planning on using it. They've tested it out as well. They seem to like it. So it really is personal preference. Anything that you can do here, you can do in weak auras. You can do more in weak auras than you can do in this. But this is a nice, simple to use UI for setting up things like personals and trying to elevate your play a little bit. A sort of very basic use of this add-on, did I just DC? Oh no. Would be effectively using MRT reminders as an MRT note reader. This is like the most basic thing you could do. You say, I don't really want to get into all this crap. I just want to use the MRT notes I pull off of lorgs or whatever, which obviously has its own downsides for just copying other people. But say you just want to pull off your stuff from lorgs based off of your timers instead of based off of abilities that are going to happen or something like that. You want to keep it simple, but you still think this might be useful. You can actually set this up just as a note reader. So if I wanted to go in here and just say, I just want this to read my MRT note, and that's it. It actually has that ability. So if you go down and use note timers, you can hover over the question mark and see that this says timers for all lines in your MRT note with player's name and the time brackets. So this is effectively it. You just took the Kaze weak aura and you just did it in MRT reminders. Now the Kaze weak aura has a lot of other customizable options that you can do. It's probably a little bit better than this in like making it nicer and do a little bit more exactly what you want. But if you're really bare bones and basic and you just say, I just wanted to read my MRT note and I just want one add-on, I don't want to have to do it in weak auras, boom, you just did it right there. MRT timers, say 5 seconds, done. Go over here, I think it's %text. I believe it's %text, which is basically if you hover over this, yeah, it says it'll tell you the one word after your player's name. So then in your MRT note, you would just go in here, you make sure your name is before whatever you want it to say, and then it would just print the text, and that's it. You're done. You've just created Kaze's weak aura at the most basic level in MRT reminders. I don't think this is very useful for that. That's a really basic use case. Why not just use Kaze? It's been working for most people for a long time, but that's just another option that I wanted to let people know. Is like, hey, if you just want to do this all in one add-on, you've got it all right here for you. This is just weak auras with a different UI, so it all works that way. Thank you all for watching. I hope you found this helpful. I think if you do use this, it will certainly benefit your defensive play, make you more tankier. You'll be that guy who never dies if you end up using it properly. Obviously, you can go overboard. Don't try to think of every possible scenario that you could plug into this, but using it for just simplified, hey, tell me if my defensive is available and a mechanic is coming up, and maybe I have this debuff or something like that, it's going to be super impactful on your play to help you not have to think about that sort of stuff. Yeah, I hope this was helpful for everyone. If you enjoyed it, if you think this was useful content, like and subscribe. Thank you for supporting me.